Hi, welcome to Get Lit. My name's Pete Crooks. I'm senior editor and senior writer at Diablo magazine in Walnut Creek. We're here at the Walnut Creek Public Library, and on Get Lit, we talk with local writers about their creative process and their love of libraries. Today, we are very pleased to have Ann Geldor, a first-time author, here with us at the Walnut Creek Library. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out. Now, can you tell us about your first book?
Okay, my first book is called Bigfoot and the Baby. It's a novel. It's a satire of consumer culture and religion. The elevator pitch is a woman searches for God and finds Bigfoot instead. But it takes place in a fictional version of Southern California in the 80s, and there are lots of adventures, and things turn out all right in the end.
Well, this is a very impressive first book. As writers know, it's hard to get published, and fiction is definitely a tricky genre, and then satirical fiction that requires like a very unique voice. And so can you talk about how you developed that voice and how it applies to this book?
Yeah, I think it's just my voice, but it took a long time. I had always wanted to write about Bigfoot in some way, and the thing about Bigfoot is scary and Bigfoot is funny, and I didn't know how to balance that at first, and so the book took about 8 years to write, and I probably wrote in a bunch of different tones, and sometimes it was more frightening, and it's ended up being, I think mostly there are some parts that are a little bit scary. I think the most scary parts actually don't involve Bigfoot, but I tried to get a balance of sort of being amused at the things we're afraid of a little bit. So what I ended up doing was I wrote a lot of stuff that kind of would peter out because it wasn't going the right way. And then what I eventually ended up doing is saying, look, I'm just going to put together all the parts that I like and then just kind of believe that they will stick together because probably I like them for a reason and they probably connect for that reason. So it has a slightly fragmentary quality, which I like.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think that it ended up just being, the way I see the world is I am sort of a dark-hearted soul, but I also find things sort of, I think there's a way to be amused and also kind of horrified at the same time. And I think that the book sort of walks that balance, or I try to.
And the interest in I loved Leonard Nimoy's show In Search Of growing up. And still sometimes I'll look on YouTube and they've got all the episodes of In Search Of. So he would go on In Search of Bigfoot, In Search of the Loch Ness Monster,
I always watched
the Bermuda Triangle. So what was it about Bigfoot that, was it even, I remember there were episodes of the $6 Million Man that involved Bigfoot.
Yes, I saw that one too. And I think I was very disappointed in that Bigfoot. Like that
in the $6 Million Man version?
Even when I was a kid, I was like,
that's not it.
That's not Bigfoot. I think that the interest, I did see some show, I don't know if it was Leonard Nimoy's show, I think there was a show that was also on TV called, in the 70s Bigfoot was huge. And I think it had something to do with just the counterculture and people kind of going back to the land and then people being afraid of people going back to the land and what does this mean? But also this fantasy about, being sort of a wild man, wild person, having no responsibilities, living in the woods. So I saw something on TV when I was about 9 called, I think it was called Monsters, Mysteries, or Myths. I looked that up on Google as well, and there was this, first of all, it showed the clip of the famous Roger Patterson film, which was filmed in 1969, and I think most people think it's a hoax, but I know there are tons of people out there who absolutely believe it's real. We know the famous thing where the Bigfoot kind of walks through this forest clearing, kind of turns and looks in that famous pose. And I remember being really fascinated by that footage and thinking there was something about it that was so fake that was almost made it more compelling. And it reminded me a lot of the, who's the animator, his name just went right out of my head, who makes those the claymation guy who died a couple of years ago.
Harryhausen?
That guy.
Right, Ray Harryhausen.
And so the motion of the creature in that footage reminded me sort of those monsters and that kind of stop motion, sort of jittery, and that's almost kind of more scary and more intriguing than an actual, something that looked more real and more smooth. So I remember, and that coincided with my family having a cottage up in northern Michigan that we used to go to every summer. And back then it seemed like we were very much in the woods. I mean, now it's not the woods, but for someone from suburban Cleveland, it was the woods, And so at night I would get kind of spooked. It was very quiet, much quieter than I was used to. And I just remember thinking, I bet Bigfoot's you know, and every now and then someone would be driving home from a bar at 4 o'clock in the morning and see Bigfoot crossing the road. You know, I was an impressionable kid.
And where was the footage? It was Patterson that shot
Yes.
this? Where was that footage?
Up in Northern California, like
okay, that's what I thought.
yeah, very Northern California, like Oregon border.
It's interesting, at that period of time, the late 60s, 70s, there were a lot of hoaxes and myths, and I mean, we were landing on the moon that summer, I guess, and in '69, and you know, a lot of people still think that was a hoax.
True.
I just watched this documentary, Room 237. Have you seen this
Yes,
film?
I did see that.
About Stephen King's, or Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining, and these conspiracy theorists who have put so much study and theory into, you know, that The Shining is a metaphor for Holocaust, or the Holocaust of the Native American, or that Stanley Kubrick filmed the moon landing. And, and so what is it about that period of time, do you think, that there was this great adventure and new exploration, but also this sort of fascination with UFOs, with you know, other natural species? That's
a really good question. I mean, there may have been a whole bunch of different reasons. I mean, my first thought was drugs, but maybe the sort of the atomic age, and this, you know, the sense that we could be annihilated at any moment, and certainly, you know, growing up in the 70s and 80s, really thinking like tomorrow it could happen, you know, that there was maybe just a real desire for sort of other worlds or other possibilities, you know, that this isn't the only option. So maybe someone will come down in a spaceship and save us, or, you know, and there's all kinds of things about Bigfoot that, you know, Bigfoot was from another planet. And I read all these books when I was up in northern Michigan, and, you know, I would devour these sort of terrible paperbacks, you know, about that they actually lived in underground caves, and they were from other planets, and they were, you know, sort of building a small army, you know, that over time they would, you know, and they had whatever extrasensory perception, and, you know, I mean, it wasn't just, you know, a half man, half ape. There was like way more going on.
Fascinating. And so this childhood fascination that you have with this creature that may or may not exist turns into this great creative work that you get to make as an adult. So how satisfying was that to kind of play that forward all these years later?
It ended up being very satisfying. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, I didn't really capture what I wanted to do in this book, and I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do, but now that the book is written, I feel like that was the book I wanted to write. And I think what I really did want to capture was, half the time I was really amused by Bigfoot, and half the time I was scared. You know, and I wanted to, again, capture that balance, or that line. And yeah, the desire for mystery, right? I mean, I think in some ways, if Bigfoot really was found and sort of analyzed and all, I think that would be very terribly disappointing, because it's more interesting to be like, okay, is it out there, and what is it? And, you know, I think I saw something. What was it? You know, that's almost more compelling than saying, okay, there's this kind of, you know, relic from whatever, a branch of apes that, you know, were in South America and sort of made their way up here, or whatever it is.
It's always more exciting to have that veil of mystery and the possibility of what could be out there. On a different topic, but it just comes to mind, I had a chance to interview the journalist Bob Woodward. And he came to speak in Walnut Creek last year, and I've always been a huge fan of All the President's Men and what those journalists were able to do. But a few years ago, Woodward wrote a follow-up book called The Secret Man, which was about the identity of Deep Throat. And so, you know, we finally learned the real identity of Deep Throat, who was Mark Felt was a FBI higher up, and he was scorned. He thought he was going to be promoted, and, you know, it filled in a lot of questions, but I still kind of prefer the Hal Holbrook in a shadowy parking garage smoking a cigarette.
That guy.
You know, sometimes it's more fun to not know the answer. You know, it's more intriguing. So what did you read growing up? And was there a library in this little community?
Well, in northern Michigan there probably was, but what I read during the summers when we were at our cottage was my grandmother's sort of infinite supply of back issues of Reader's Digest. And that was another source of like these kind of bizarre stories. There are always, you know, being again sort of the 70s and early 80s, there were stories about, you know, kids taking LSD and throwing themselves off a building and thinking they could fly, and it was the drugs. Oh God, watch out for the drugs, So I read a lot of this kind of fear mongering for middle-aged women, which struck me as sort of very powerfully, and I went through all of those. So I don't remember going to a library there. I remember going to bookstores. But certainly growing up, in a suburb of Cleveland, there was actually quite a nice library, that we went to. And then my parents were both readers. I grew up in a house with lots of books in it. Even today, when I go visit my mom, there's books there's so many books that there isn't enough place for them. They're stacked up on the floor, and that's how it is in our condo. And we've always loved books, and I feel like I'm very, very lucky. I was read to, it was always, what are you reading? Tell me about what you're reading. So it was just a natural part of life.
And your book takes place in the 80s?
It does.
Now that's a decade. I kind of was a teenager and went off to college in the 80s. And at the time, the 80s felt so very current.
Yes.
And I was just watching the last episode of David Letterman, and they had clips from his morning show that was on in 1980 and the early late night with David Letterman, and it looks like it's another planet. The styles of the 1980s were different, and on satellite radio, there's these channels: the 70s on 7, the 80s on 8. Even the pop music of the 80s sounds entirely different than any other decade. There's so much synthesizer, and there's such a synthetic sheen to the 1980s. So I've become quite a custodian of 80s culture. So that makes your book all the more appealing. But walk us through that. Why did you set it in that time period, and then what did you bring to life from the 80s? I
mean, I think partly also because I was more or less the same age as you growing up. That I was a teenager and then went off to college in the 80s, and it's the artifice also strikes me, and I think just there's this kind of very apocalyptic feeling.
Remember the day after?
Yeah, and just, with Ronald Reagan becoming president, and this very strong feeling that, he was just going to wander into the Situation Room and push a button, one day, and, just really this sense of it doesn't really seem possible now. But
well, he famously joked about that with the live wire on it, and he was giving his radio address, and he said, "Let's press the button, and we're going to nuke the Russians."
Yeah, and then, so it seemed like something. So there was this sense of I wanted to capture that kind of apocalyptic feeling, and I can't remember exactly when the late Great Planet Earth came out. I think it was the late 70s, but I remember my friends. My close friend's mother was very, very into that, and she took us to see the movie. And again, there's these very terrifying images. I mean, even though I didn't really believe that, there was something so visceral about these images of whatever, the Whore of Babylon, drinking this cup of blood, and just all fire and people being dragged into hell, and and it was very, very vivid and very sort of something very subconscious about this imagery that got you whether or not you thought it was true. And so I wanted to, I think, capture that sort of intensity. I guess, like you said, there's this artifice, there's this bright colors and sort of this bubblegum pop and all this, and then at the same time there was this really visceral fear of nuclear annihilation and, kind of religious fanaticism. And this was the time too when the religious right became very prominent in politics, and before that it wasn't really a thing, and it started becoming a thing. And so people who really thought that the end of the world was nigh were making policy, and that was scary. So there was a lot of stuff that I think sort of came together then. But I think personally for me it was a very intense time just because I was that age.
Right, and I think that's still so scary, the sort of lack of practicality. From my opinion, to hear somebody with a last days point of view, that's not somebody we need making pragmatic policy for everyone.
You're not planning for the long term, are you?
Right, yeah. It's kind of like maxing out your credit card.
Yeah.
What's even more frightening is that in hindsight, looking back at the 80s, as some of those cultural changes were happening, you still hear about Reagan and Tip O'Neill, going out for a drink at the end of the day, and that we're in a much different place
That's true.
from that politically.
That's
and,
true.
I don't know what forces have really shoved us into such a polarized culture, but what are your favorite books and films and records from the 80s?
Oh, goodness.
I just think of Blue Velvet. That one pops to mind as this great sort of Leave It to Beaver cocktail of idealism and then dark underbelly. And it was really at that point, those David Lynch movies.
Right, and Twin Peaks was like 90, I think.
Yeah, that probably
so
was
that's
early
still
90s.
kind of the 80s, and that was, that certainly interested me. Let's see, I mean, I was very into the sort of Let's Dance, David Bowie.
Yeah.
And then from that I went back to sort of the darker and more interesting stuff, which I also liked, but I think that I liked, the sort of the pompadour and the sort of post-disco things that he was doing. That was fun. In the 70s I was a big Queen fan.
Did you ever get to see Freddie Mercury?
I did. I did. I went to Queen concerts with my dad and my friend and her dad and her sister, and it was a big ritual. It was a lot of fun. But he was, he was about that big because we were up in the.
But an amazing.
But he was
performer,
there. Yeah. I was in the presence.
I've heard that Sacha Baron Cohen is going to play Freddie Mercury in a biopic, which sounds like an exciting role for him. He's a super talented guy.
It might work. Yeah.
So Queen and Bowie, those are. Spectacularly impressive performers. Like the records are great,
That's true.
But watching that Ziggy Stardust film, there's nothing quite like that. And I've interviewed Candy Clark, who's an actress who was nominated for an Oscar for American Graffiti, but she acted with Bowie in The Man Who Fell to Earth, which has become quite a classic.
Yeah, it's a wonderful film.
Do you remember a sci-fi movie from the 80s called Liquid Sky?
Yeah, I remember it. I don't remember seeing it.
It's super rare. The last remaining Central Contra Costa video store has a DVD copy of Liquid Sky. I was just writing about that. Crazy movie, but as far as you can't get more 80s and sort of post-punk weird than Liquid Sky. Big recommendation.
I feel like I've seen sort of images from it, but I don't remember the story.
A huge cult hit at the time and has been largely forgotten, but it would be great to have theaters right across the street. There used to be a theater called the El Rey that had Rocky Horror at midnight, and that would be the kind of place you would see Liquid Sky in '84. You went to college at the University of Michigan?
Yes.
And what did you study?
I studied English and Russian.
Okay.
Double major.
And did you have this vision that you wanted to be an author?
I did not. I came to the idea that I would be an author pretty late, like probably well into my 30s before I really started taking it seriously.
Okay.
And in fact, I remember I studied both as an undergrad and grad. I intended to be a professor of comparative literature, so that's why I came out to go to grad school in Berkeley. And went all the way through and got my PhD, and then sort of job market was awful, and at that point I just didn't want to bang my head against the wall anymore. I thought, I'll do something else, and that was when I started kind of saying, hey, maybe I could actually, instead of just reading stuff all the time, I could write something. But it was all kind of just an experiment, and I remember when I was probably an undergrad saying to somebody, I could never write a novel, that's the last thing I could do. Like, I could maybe write poetry, but I don't know how to put a plot together, so I forget it, I could never write a novel. And then somebody's like, oh, well, let me see if I can.
Well, that personal exercise of writing, that's just personal challenge. I think my first book was published this year, and I've been doing a lot of author appearances, and people ask me, how do I get published? And it doesn't necessarily start like that. It starts with wanting to write, and wanting to write every day. And I started writing. I was living at the Grand Canyon National Park. I started writing a postcard or a letter every day, just because if I sent something out every day, I got more mail back. And then I got into that ritual of making sure I sat down to write every day, and it was just correspondence. It wasn't, with this intention of writing a novel. So build up the skills. I'm interested in, somebody that went from University of Michigan as an undergrad to a graduate study program at UC Berkeley. I've heard about these different college towns around the country that are the Berkeley of Michigan, or the Berkeley of the Midwest. And Ann Arbor, Michigan has always been referred to as the Berkeley of that part of the country. And can you verify that?
I think that's true. I mean, I was politically active with a bunch of sort of hippie canvassers, and there was. I would say that it segued pretty naturally into Berkeley, although Berkeley was, Ann Arbor raised to sort of the third or fourth power, that it was, there was just more of everything.
Right.
And so it took some adjusting too, because I was used to sort of everything being sort of a smaller scale, and so it was sort of a, small town girl goes to a big city a little bit.
And how did you pick Berkeley?
I think because it was the Ann Arbor of California.
Right. Had you been to visit the Bay
I had
Area
not.
before?
I had never been to California until I moved out. And I think it was just I wanted something different. I was a little tired of the Midwest. I wanted palm trees in my yard, I wanted sunshine. That was a big thing. We're not having it right now, but in theory, there was sun. And once I was there, I was like, yeah, this works for me.
Yeah.
So it was.
What was the chez panisse of Ann Arbor?
Oh, I just went to like crappy undergrad. I never went out to anywhere fancy. If I did, I can't remember where it was. But,
and then when you got to Berkeley, and it's California, and it's the beautiful Bay Area with one of the world's great cities right across the bridge. What were your first impressions, and where did you live on campus?
I lived very close to campus. I lived in a sort of bungalow that was walking distance, like 7 minutes away, and so I was pretty much on campus a lot, and I was there for the big '89 earthquake, and was walking home from class when it happened, and sort of stumbled and came home and some stuff was on the floor, and found out later how bad it was.
Yeah, I was at UCSD walking home to watch the World Series game because my Oakland A's were playing in the series, and then it got scary fast. I was trying to call home to see if my folks here in Walnut Creek were okay, and there's just like no getting through. Yeah. And so even Berkeley at that time is a much different place. Like you had. Ruthie's Inn was a great music club that was still there, and I don't know if the Keystone was still in Berkeley.
I don't know. Yeah.
Keystone was a great music club on University that the Police played their first tour there. Tom Petty, like all kinds of great British and American rock acts would always stop at the Keystone. There was one in Palo Alto and one in Berkeley. But culturally, what was Berkeley like when you got out here?
It's hard to separate Berkeley culture from graduate school culture, because I was really immersed in the graduate school culture, which is a little different than the sort of larger thing, and I was very attracted to sort of the hippie culture and so on, but the grad school culture was not that. The grad school culture was, work 20 hours a day, always be reading, always be talking about what you're reading.
So you're just totally consumed with school.
And I was pretty consumed with it, but not as much as some other people, and so I would sort of wonder, like, well, doesn't anyone want to go out and get a drink? And a lot of people didn't, because and it took me a while to go, okay, what we're doing is we're just reading and working all the time. That was hard. I mean, I think that I eventually found some people that maybe weren't as intense, and maybe that's why I didn't end up.
They could set aside an hour to go to Albatross.
Exactly.
And why did you set the book in Southern California?
Again, I think because of the apocalyptic feeling. It's like if you're going to have an apocalypse, it has to be somewhere near Los Angeles. So it's actually in sort of the Bakersfield area, and then out in the Mojave Desert. And I think that there's just something about the light, especially in the Mojave, with just this intense color, intense blue sky, that maybe picks up that sort of artificiality and the sort of awe and terror of some of the other things that I was talking about. I don't, I haven't lived in Southern California. I had to go down and drive around Bakersfield and visit some, museums, and then drive out to Red Rock Canyon and look around to just sort of get a feel for it, because I didn't really know. And also just because there were some characters that I had based on some friends, relatives who were from Bakersfield, and it seemed natural to have some of those events occur in a fictional version thereof, yes.
Bakersfield is a really interesting place.
Yeah.
I went to see a bar band at this crazy Roadhouse Saloon in Bakersfield years ago, and I remember just driving down this road to the saloon was just business after business was a place to get like the side of your van or truck painted with you know, like an eagle or
Right.
Yeah.
There's a van in my book that gets painted. So
Well,
there you go.
Bakersfield is
It was the place to do it.
high density body paint location. So finally, this show we really try and celebrate our Walnut Creek Library, but I'm always interested in how libraries have affected writers' lives. So whether it was childhood or researching at UC Berkeley or working on this book, like how have you used libraries in your life and career?
All of those things. Certainly growing up, the library was just a regular part of life, picking out books. And just browsing through the shelves and seeing what you could come across. And more recently, just when I was writing this book, I needed to write a scene, a kind of logging scene in the Olympic National Park, or that area. And I had been there, but I needed like some sort of more old time. What were the old time machinery that they used? How did it actually work? How did they actually fell a tree? And so I just went down to the San Carlos Library, and I can't remember if I had to special order the book or if it was there, but there was this great picture book of just like pictures of logging from the 40s, and it's like, that's what I need, and it just gave me everything I needed. And, the internet is great, but sometimes you need to just sit down with a book and kind of look at big pictures and page through it and go back and forth, and there's something different about having that in your hands. So that was, it was one of those things where I didn't think they would have it, and I didn't think I'd be able to get it, and they did,
That's great. And there's something meditative about, sort of intellectual about the space that a library provides, a place to go do research or read or do writing. I mean, there's so many uses of these libraries now. I mean, as much as I love checking out books and using the library as a sort of a writing sanctuary, the video collection that this public library system has, and how easy it is to, I wanted to see a Billy Wilder movie, lesser known film called The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, that is not on Netflix, it's hard to find, but I went on the library website and there's one copy at the Martinez Library, and I had it sent to my branch, and unbelievably convenient and such a great resource. So your first book is out. Are you working on a follow-up?
I have finished a follow-up,
Wow.
and I now have an agent who is sending the book out for me. So we're waiting to hear from the first wave of submissions.
Wow! Well, congratulations on that. I look forward to having you back on.
All right. Well, I
Get
hope I
Lit.
can come back.
Is it in the same genre as Bigfoot and the
Yes
Baby?
and no. It's about mystery,
Okay.
in the same way, but it actually is more of a mystery genre.
Absolute treat to have you
Well,
here
thank you.
on Get Lit,
Yes.
and congratulations on Bigfoot and the Baby,
Thank you.
and best of luck with your follow-up.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to having you back on the show when,
All right.
when your next book comes out.
Look forward to coming back.
And welcome to Walnut Creek.
Thanks.
Thank you at home for tuning in to Get Lit. It's always a treat to meet authors and hear their stories, and hang out in the beautiful Walnut Creek Public Library. So just keep watching. We're on all the time. You're going to always meet another fascinating author on Get Lit. Thanks for watching. I'm Pete Crooks.